How surprise works is actually one of the really tricky bits of D&D 5th edition. Sometimes we're hanging on to rules from previous games and not quite able to figure out how those work in 5th edition. Other times we get caught in some of the minutia and we create things like surprise rounds or other situations where the monsters go before anybody rolls initiative. So in this video, we're going to dive deep into surprise to really understand how it's meant to work, and I'm going to offer some tips and tricks to make surprise work really well at the table. If you enjoy this video, you can subscribe to the Sly Flourish newsletter to get a D&D related article sent directly to your inbox every week. You can also support me directly on Patreon and get access to all kinds of tips, tricks, and tools for running better D&D games yourself. You can also pick up my books, Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, The Lazy DM's Workbook, or The Lazy DM's Companion, all at the Sly Flourish bookstore, linked in the show notes below. I also have an article on how surprise works, linked in the show notes. You can read that. It's going to have about the same material that I have in this video. There's two things right up front that we need to think about with surprise. One is there is no such thing as a surprise round. And two, there is no real ability to act hostily towards another creature without first rolling initiative. Those are a couple of things that sound kind of counterintuitive. Sometimes we think if the characters get surprised against the monsters, they get a whole free round of combat before the monsters get to do anything at all. And second, sometimes we think we can actually act, and many times players will say, I want to try to do something before we roll initiative. I either want to pull out my bow and take a shot at them, or I want to hit them with something before initiative is rolled because they have surprise. That's not actually how the game works. Instead, anytime any creature does some kind of hostile action or perceived hostile action towards another character, initiative is rolled. As far as surprise is concerned, surprise is actually more of a condition than it is a state for the game. So a character can be surprised, and maybe a whole group can be surprised, but the whole group is surprised individually. You figure out whether or not each character is surprised before you figure out anything else. It's also important to understand that there's a bunch of related rules to surprise. Surprise doesn't just kind of stand on its own. Surprise is tied to the rules for stealth, it's tied to the rules for initiative, it's tied to rules for dark vision and lighting, it's tied to ability checks, group checks, and passive checks. There's a lot of inner working bits that all have to do with surprise, that surprise is all connected to. We need to pay attention to all of these little bits while we're trying to figure out how surprise works. It helps us if we understand exactly what the rules are as written in the 2014 Player's Handbook for D&D 5th edition. Right now I have it loaded up on D&D Beyond, but you can find this on page 189 of the Player's Handbook. And it says, the DM determines who might be surprised. If neither side tries to be stealthy, they automatically notice each other. Otherwise, the DM compares the dexterity stealth checks of anyone hiding with the passive wisdom perception score of each creature on the opposing side. Any creature or monster that doesn't notice a threat is surprised at the start of the encounter. If you're surprised, you can't move or take an action on your first turn of the combat, and you can't take reactions until that turn ends. A member of a group can be surprised even if the other members aren't. There's a lot of little tricky bits in this. It seems like, it's like 4 sentences. It's not that hard. But there's a lot of little tricky. For example, when we talk about a threat, does that mean any threat or all threats? There's a whole section of the Sage Advice Compendium linked in the show notes below that also discusses surprise, and it has a particularly interesting line that matters in this conversation. And it's the bottom line of this paragraph. You can be surprised even if your companions aren't, and you aren't surprised if even one of your foes fails to catch you unaware. This is where we have to think about how this actually operates in the game, and that means understanding the 3 kinds of ability checks that might take place. Again, the DM is responsible for determining which kind of ability check we're going to use of these 3. And those ability checks are the standard ability check. You roll an ability check, you add your proficiency bonus if you're trained in a particular skill, like making a dexterity stealth check. Then there's group checks. Group checks are done when a DM decides that it's better for an entire group to make the check together. An example is if you wanted to do a group stealth check, you would ask your entire group to make stealth checks, and then you would look at all of the scores that they've got and decide did they beat a particular DC in order to determine if they stealth. In this case, that DC would be the passive perception of the monster who might detect them. The third type of check is a passive check. In this case, we just add 10 to whatever their ability bonus plus the proficiency bonus if they're trained in a skill, and that is the check that they automatically make without actually rolling any dice. So those are 3 types of checks that we might make: a regular ability check, a group check, or a passive check. Now, which kind of these checks we're using is often going to depend on whether or not a group is surprised. And the example is really tied in that last sentence. You aren't surprised if even one of your foes fails to catch you unaware. For example, in the lower right corner, we have 4 gnolls up against a group of characters. If I'm doing it as written, I will roll a stealth check for each one of these gnolls. and determine if any of those nulls rolled a stealth check that is below the passive perception of the characters. Now, if I'm rolling that many stealth checks, that's a lot of stealth checks, and likely one of them is going to roll a check that's so low that all of them will detect it. And at that point, there's no surprise. So if you're rolling your stealth checks like this, that means you're almost always going to guarantee that no one is going to be surprised. The same is true on the characters side. If the characters are trying to be stealthy and you have each member of the characters roll their individual stealth checks, it's very likely one of them is going to roll a check so low that the enemies, with their passive perception, they're going to notice at least one of them. And if that group notices at least one of them, they are not surprised at all. Now, if instead you use a group check, the likelihood for success is a lot more likely, because now you're using the average of the stealth checks that a group makes instead of the worst one. So in this case, a null has a passive perception of 10. If that group of characters all rolls their group stealth check, even though Dorn, who's wearing heavy armor, is rolling at disadvantage, if the other 3 are able to get the average of their stealth check above a 10, that means they could potentially surprise the nulls. So if the characters are using a group check rather than individual stealth checks, they are a lot more likely to surprise their enemies than the other way around. Now, the same is true if it's going the other way. If the nulls are trying to surprise the characters, and you have each of the nulls roll an individual stealth check, it's likely one of them is going to roll so low that the passive perceptions of all of the characters are going to notice that one null, which means they are no longer surprised. It's quite possible that the results of that are going to be higher than the passive checks of at least some of the characters. And again, some of the characters can be surprised, and other ones can't be. Now, you might also use a passive stealth check instead of rolling for it if you have like a lot of nulls. And in that case, you do it the same way you do your passive perception. You say their dexterity is +1, they're not trained in stealth, so they have a passive stealth of 11. If it happens to be that some of the characters have perception checks that are lower than 11, they are going to be surprised. And again, now you're just comparing passives to passives. That's really fast, no dice rolling, you can just determine that certain groups are getting surprised. Now, if that's a little too static for you, another way you could do it is you could roll one stealth check for the entire group of nulls and roll at a disadvantage. And you're rolling at disadvantage because there's so many nulls. This is a total house rule. This isn't how the rules work, but it's a really quick check to determine, are those nulls likely to surprise the characters? You can roll the check, roll at disadvantage because there's so many nulls, and any character's passive score that's below that check, that character is surprised by those nulls. These 3 different ways to use ability checks gives DMs a lot of control over how surprise is going to work. If you are actually in a situation where you expect that surprise is likely, then you might use group checks. If you want to give the characters the benefit of the doubt, you would let them do a group check rather than rolling individual stealth checks. Because again, if you're rolling individual stealth checks, it's likely the monsters are going to notice at least one of them. But if you want to give the characters the opportunity to surprise their foes, you can roll a group stealth check instead. The same works the other way. If you have monsters and you want to give at least the option for those monsters to be able to surprise the characters, you could either use a passive stealth score for all of the monsters, or you could roll a group stealth check for those monsters, or you could just roll a single stealth check at disadvantage and see how they do compared to the characters' passive perceptions. There's one other tricky rule in this whole situation, which is lighting. A lot of times you're in darkness when you're doing this kind of thing. Characters are in darkness, the monsters are in darkness, and we often hear, oh, but I have dark vision, so I can see everything. It's important to remember that dark vision doesn't let characters see everything. When you're in a situation of total darkness, a character that has dark vision is seeing it as though it's low light, and in low light, they are at disadvantage on perception checks, and their passive perception score is -5. So if they're not using light, they're a lot less likely to see monsters that are in stealth. Now, the same is true for the monsters. The monsters are also at -5 to see the characters. So you might have groups that just completely run into each other, completely oblivious to the fact that the other group is there. If any group is using light, the other one is probably not going to be surprised. Almost certainly they see the light. And if they're seeing that light, even if it's light in a different area, if they see something that puts them on edge, they likely don't have surprise. Now, a lot of all of this conversation basically means that surprise can be really hard to get. Given how powerful surprise is, the idea that a character who is surprised essentially loses an entire round of combat, it seems likely that you wouldn't want to have surprise used all that often. So only in special circumstances might you say that one group surprises another, and instead you might just go with the idea that they can't see you. They're aware, they're not surprised, they can still do their actions, and because they can't see you, you have advantage on your first attack against them. That idea of getting advantage on your first attack, that's mostly the benefit that we would expect from surprise in the first place. Otherwise, surprise is really, really powerful, because essentially one group can get a whole number of attacks on another group before that other group can even react to it. They basically get 2 full rounds of combat before the other one gets an entire round. So now I'm going to give you a few easy tricks for using surprise in your own D&D game. One is, remember that surprise is really rare, that because you would generally be rolling individual stealth checks versus the passive perception scores of characters, somebody's likely to see one of the people that's stealthing up against them, and they're likely to fail that check. So most of the time, you don't really have to worry about surprise. Instead, worry about visibility and give characters and creatures advantage on their attacks when the other group can't see them. If you have a situation for one particular monster attempting to surprise the characters, for example, my favorite, the black pudding in the guard robe. If one character is sticking their head into an ancient guard robe and there's a black pudding that's been hiding down there, that black pudding is going to be able to use its stealth check against the characters. In that case, I wouldn't even bother rolling for initiative yet. I know that I'm violating the rule. The rule is the minute one of the pseudopods of the black pudding comes up to smack the person looking through the guard robe in the face, then you would roll initiative. But instead, I'm going to skip that whole process of rolling initiative, because if the black pudding has a stealth check better than the passive perception score of the person sticking their head in the guard robe, they're going to get a free round of combat anyway. I'll just speed that whole process, let the black pudding hit the person with the guard robe, and then roll initiative and see where it goes. Instead of making the player feel bad for losing an entire turn, you just have the monster make an attack and then you drop into initiative. Again, it's a little bit of a house rule, but it certainly speeds things up, and it's about as effective as surprise would be. As I mentioned, it's really worth knowing that in your toolbox, you have those 3 different kinds of ability checks: standard ability checks, passive checks, and group checks. And understanding how those checks operate in a situation like surprise, that those who are making group checks are a lot more likely to surprise another group than those that are rolling individually. And the other trick is really to understand how lighting, how stealth, and how perception all work together, because all of these interwoven rules all have different situations that occur. But the easiest trick is just to remember that surprise is really hard to get, and you can almost always just replace surprise with the idea that certain creatures can't see other creatures and get advantage on their attack. I hope you enjoyed this video. Again, if you did, subscribe to the Sly Flourish newsletter to get a weekly D&D article sent right to your inbox. You can also support me directly on Patreon and get access to all kinds of tips, tricks, adventures, and source books to run your own D&D games. And you can pick up my books, Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, The Lazy DM's Workbook, and The Lazy DM's Companion at the Sly Flourish bookstore. Links to that are all in the show notes below. Thank you very much. Have a great day, and get out there and play some D&D.